think that's one of the biggest challenges that I see with the companies we work with is like, and Johan, you alluded to this earlier as well, is just data, like data hygiene, data strategy. Like, who does that sit with? Who is owning it? Who's making sure that everyone is speaking the same language across the board? The number of times that I've seen, marketing's definition of SQL versus sales definition of SQL being different. And then also when you go into the CRM system and you look at the pipeline and you're like, where's the data? Oh, wait, it's in this other spreadsheet. So I think that's also one of the things that's really key is making sure that there's one, the right set of data being tracked. Two, there's accountability behind that data. And thirdly, that everyone actually understands what it is that they're looking at. Johan, you look like you're
because data is such a conceptual thing that half the people don't really know what we're talking about here, but we're talking about what customers are doing on your platform. That's what data is, right? And data tells a story. And I think often we just forget that because we just think that it's like a bunch of stuff that just sits in databases. But this is actually supposed to tell a story of what your customers are doing, but whether from a finance point of view, from a customer experience point of view. So I think starting point is have a common definition of what these different metrics that you're tracking are, what the different data points mean, or whether usually a metric is a combination of data points, right? So just have a common database or a definition library that explains from everyone's point of view what something is. What is net churn? And what are the data points that make up net churn, and have a little excerpt of what that exactly means so that everyone can look it up and they can all have the same understanding of what we're talking, because that's the starting point, to have a common language that you can work, that you can speak to. Then the second, I think, is to have some kind of a workflow or a process that is sanitized, so that when new features get built or new things get introduced in your internal workflows or external facing stuff with customers, that you have a way of not introducing additional chaos or entropy into your data models. Because often the first problem that often comes up is that I'll get an executive coming to me, or middle management will come to me and say, you've introduced this new feature, but you're not tracking it. And you're causing all sorts of chaos downstream, either for finance or for the data teams. So having some kind of a data audit when you're building new stuff, but then also looking back at you probably have a lot of data debt as well, because you probably built a lot of stuff in the early days that you weren't tracking properly. So just having kind of doing maybe a comprehensive audit to see, okay, are we actually, what's the health of our data at the moment, and where do we need to focus? Because no one's got it 100% accurate. I think every company, I think there's maybe 0.1% of all companies could say that they're really have a clean data model. And I'm not the data expert, but I've seen all of these complex systems and different functions kind of fighting with each other, and it's really often just a language problem to start with. Get everyone speaking the same language, have workflows and processes that make sense, and then I think you can start to address these issues.
Data is, how the customers are using your platform. And I want to say it's also how your employees are spending your time. And partially it's because that's data as well. And so I'm just trying to address a few of the comments in there, not ignoring it, to say, I think Johan mentioned it earlier, do we expose the unit economics of the company? I think if you start helping people understand that how they're spending their time is part of the data that you're using to make decisions. And one of the things that you can do is be transparent about how, if they've tracked their time and you've concatenated it and you've looked at it and you've made decisions based on it, and you start sharing that information of how you used that information, and they're not just doing it to waste their time. Because as you're scaling, you actually can't keep pace on what every single person is doing. It's just by the nature of the scaling of the business. And how every person self-selects to spend their time, you want to give them autonomy and those kind of things. And it's really important to understand what that is so that you can correct. So I think that the way to kind of start putting that into your culture is to start talking about it in a way that says this is informing decisions and it's not punitive. Sometimes finance people, they're pretty cut and dry, and maybe it comes across as punitive. And I think that more, not always, but sometimes they go, you must start recording this because we must need it for R&D credits or whatever else it is. And if you kind of start bridging the gap, and leaders in these functional areas start kind of saying, oh yeah, you got to go do it because finance says you have to do it. And they start kind of really embracing the concept that how you're spending your time in a SaaS business is incredibly important as you're scaling, and it's how we make future decisions. If you can start ingraining that into the culture, and not using it as punitive or dry, and then share back how it was being used, I think that has worked in the organizations that I've worked with, because most of the time I tell people to start tracking that.
I think often, like you said, like it feels like finance is trying to punish you for spending things or time on the wrong things, right? And I think often in product and engineering, especially design as well, you're trying to build some level of momentum, right? So you get started on something and then it snowballs and then everyone's moving in the same direction. And then finance looks at it and says, hey, this is actually probably not the thing we should be prioritizing. Maybe we should be moving more resources towards this or that. But the snowball is already rolling, and finance is usually the one that wants to stop the snowball. And they're faced with a lot of resistance, but they're trying to stop that snowball for very good reasons, right? And I think it's also the role of the product people to listen and really be kind of honest about, like, yes, we've built a lot of momentum, but potentially in the wrong direction, right? And so, and I think it's the role, especially of the C-level, to work together rather than against each other, because often the CFO will, be at odds maybe with the CPO or other people in the executive team. And I think product's role is also really to like kind of get people to empathize with, like, finance is really, they're not doing this because they're trying to be annoying or difficult, or they're doing this because this is a real issue that has good reasoning behind it. So yeah, having that level of empathy and understanding, and then being willing to stop the snowball, or maybe like bifurcate and say, hey, let's actually cut resources because we've been spending way too much on customer experience, and maybe like CAC is really like our big problem right now. So let's actually like put resources towards that and be honest about where people are spending their time. And so, because I think there was a question there about like how do like the cultural implications of time tracking. I mean, we're not talking about like keystroke tracking, right? Like it's really more, I mean, where I've seen it done well is that you just kind of speak with different kind of managers and try to understand where are the teams spending their time. And then it's maybe an exercise that you do every once in a while, just to understand kind of where people are at, but it's not like on a data, it's not real time, like time tracking. Yeah.
I think the more that you can incorporate it to become, and again, that's, it shouldn't be the goal. You should be figuring out how to directionally get the information to make directionally correct decisions. And I think this is where sometimes an accounting brain versus an FP&A brain might come. It's like you want to make it directionally correct so that you're making the right decisions, but doesn't necessarily have to be down to the penny. I think that is the case. I will also say this, and the example that Johan gave, which is like, the product people, they're on a momentum, and then the finance person comes in and, they blame it on the finance person. And I would say this, it's like, oftentimes you make an estimate on how much you think something is going to cost to produce. And when you get into it, you find out more information that and it's not bad. I think one of the things in scale up, which is much harder to do in a larger organization, is that you're going to make the best guess on how much you think something is going to cost. And when you're in the midst of it, you've got to be measuring, because if it's going way over than your original estimate, the worst thing that you can absolutely do is continue on that without surfacing the information. So I would say, back to Johan and every other product leader, as a board member, I would say it's not the finance person, the product person should have stepped up and said, this actually is costing us more than we thought, and then brought the conversation much earlier in, because sometimes you make the decision to keep doing it, but make the decision with everyone informed instead of just doing it, going on, and don't penalize that product organization or that product or R&D organization because they really made their best guess. The worst thing you can do is keep doing it when it's extremely exceeding what you thought it was going to cost in the first place, because you're starving the leadership team from making different decisions to redirect that investment to something else. So
yeah, and maybe to add to that, like recently I came across this concept of like looking at ease on a time scale. So when you're trying to assess you're trying to create an ICE score to prioritize something, think of how easy is this thing to build right now versus how easy will it be 3 and 6 and 9 and 12 months out? Because maybe actually you're creating a lot of debt by building something quickly, but then it's going to cost you a lot more later, right? So because your initial estimate is like, at the beginning when you're building it, but you're not really thinking kind of more long-term in terms of what this is going to cost the organization. And so like try to think of ease over like on a timeline, not just as a score right now. Like maybe it's a 3 right now, but maybe it's a 5 and 6 months. And so that should factor into the costs.
Yeah, that when we talk about unit economics and something that is this unit or something that you're building, often, you see the first stages of kind of a product person understanding is how much of the allocation is R&D. And even the finance person say, well, how much of the R&D? But it's not really how much is R&D, it's how much is the R&D the one time, especially when you're talking about something with integrations. The minute that you decide in your SaaS product to support an integration, you basically have a one-time cost, and then that product and R&D line is always going to have some portion that's going to have to be there to keep that integration active. So when you decide to add an integration, understand the unit cost of an integration is never a one-time investment. It is, even just from a product perspective, it is an ongoing investment to keep it current. And then you may also have services, to actually help your customers do it. So make sure that you're knowing that unit, it's the one-time build cost, it's the ongoing maintenance of it, and then it's how much is it going to cost to create all this, the sales material associated with it, how much is it actually going to cost to support it. And because often we're looking at, sales in isolation and product in isolation and marketing in isolation, we don't actually slice it in that unit or product or feature set. And so you actually have to do it crossways. And in larger organizations, big organizations, when you scale, they start to split into business units, and those business units start doing it. But in the early stages of scaling, you really only have one P&L. So you have to start looking at these things kind of as whatever you want to call it, shadow,